Yeah, I love that voice. It says recording in progress. Right, so good morning, everybody. It's good to see a good crowd this morning for which may be our last Zoom, although who knows, never say never. And we're welcoming Andrew Sin from the Forth and Clyde Canal, who's going to speak about the canal and also the Falkirk Wheel and the future of all of that, and what's been the history and the future and what's going to be happening there. As I say, the next meeting will be in Novar Drive. It'll be the AGM, but we hope to have a little bit more than the AGM in that, you know, a bit of a relaunch. It'll be face to face. I think we're allowed, at this moment in time, we're allowed to have tea and coffee. So we just hope that as many of you as possible will be able to come, and we will, yes, follow the rules and regulations of keeping it aired and well apart, etc., etc. But more detail of that later, and we'll just concentrate on enjoying this morning's presentation from Andrew, who I've completely lost on my screen, but that doesn't matter. Andrew.
I can see you.
Good, here you are.
Right, I'm just going to do the share screen thing, which should bring some pictures up for you. So let's just see if that works first, and then we'll see how we get on. Now, hopefully you can see a slide. Just, Peter, do you want to put a thumbs up if that's working?
Yep.
Yeah, you can see it. Okay. So you should see a slide. It says Scottish Canals, Andrew Sin chair. Okay, well, we're going to go from there. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks very much indeed. I do want to say a big thanks to Peter and Helen actually for setting this up, because it's not easy to do all this sort of stuff remotely, and I'm very grateful. So yeah, so I'm chairman of Scottish Canals and have been for the last 7 years or so. I'm going to talk particularly about the Forth and Clyde Canal because I think that's of most immediate relevance to your group, but I will allude to other bits of the network because I think it's interesting. Just a wee bit about me as well. So I'm also chair of the Scottish Land Commission. So if you want to talk about land reform, feel free. I'm happy to talk about that. I also, like lots of semi-retired people, do a heap of other things. I chair a small charitable trust. I'm an independent prison monitor. We could talk about prisons. And when I've got any time left, I go walking in the hills or cycling. So lots of things there, I hope, are common interests of people in this group. But let's focus on the canals for now, and let's see how this thing works. So slide should have changed. Peter, just tell me if anything doesn't work. So the Forth and Clyde Canal is one of 5 canals in Scotland, and I think it's just worth quickly reminding ourselves of that. The Caledonian Canal up at the top in the Highlands is a big, relatively modern, it was built in the 19th rather than the 18th century canal. Still very much used by large boats, fishing vessels, yachts, military vessels, all the rest of it. The Crinan Canal is a wee canal across on the west, also relatively recent and bigger, and actually really important because if you try and take a small boat around the Mull of Kintyre with huge tidal rips and big waves, it can be very dangerous. So being able to cut through is really important. A lot of fishing boats use it too. Forth and Clyde, I don't have to tell you, but I will, goes from Bowling through to Grangemouth. There's a branch canal, what's left of the Monklands Canal, which used to go up to Coatbridge and Airdrie. Doesn't any longer, a big chunk of it's under the M8, but there's still a bit goes into Glasgow, into Spears Wharf and Portland Das. And then there's the Union Canal, which picks up the Forth and Canal and essentially was an extension. We have to really see it as an extension to the Forth and Clyde Canal. Having put the Forth and Clyde in, the Union Canal was then put in to link it through to Edinburgh so that materials, coal in particular, could be taken through to Edinburgh. So a fair old system of canals in Scotland. We're actually very lucky. Built over the 18th and into the 19th century. And Scottish Canals, there's a lot to this. I'm not going to plough through all this in great depth, but 5 canals, but in order for those canals to work, you have to have water up in the hills, which you can run down because they work by gravity. when a boat goes up the logs, it goes up the logs because the water comes down the hill and is raised up in the logs. So you need reservoirs. There's 19 reservoirs scattered about Scotland feeding these canals all the time, which does mean that the water in most of the canals is actually relatively clean, which is a good thing. There's a whole lot of aqueducts and bridges and even tunnels, some wonderful tunnels around Falkirk, very exciting. There's 5 lighthouses. You might not believe that, but there are 5 lighthouses on the Caledonian. Probably best known, well, probably not now, but second best known as the Falkirk Wheel, which is for lifting boats from the Forth and Clyde up to the Union or the other way around. And probably the best known now is the Kelpies, which were originally meant to be a boat lift, actually, and I'll talk more about that, but are now probably one of Scotland's most iconic pieces of public art. So there's lots of stuff there that we're looking after, and phenomenal potential, really remarkable potential for Scotland. They're public assets, they belong to you and I. The Scottish Canals is a public body. We are responsible to elected politicians, and so we should be, and therefore we're accountable to you. And we should be, and don't hesitate to hold me to account in the discussion that follows this. A wee bit of history. Forth and Clyde, which was the first one, the work started in 1768 at Grangemouth to cut it through. It didn't actually open until 1790. And there was then an extraordinary period of growth through into the mid-19th century, canals being created and used. Interestingly, and people forget this, most of the early canals were entirely, it was all entirely private enterprise, private finance, private investors. The government was not involved. Government was involved in the Caledonian, but not in the Central Belt canals. It was private business, private visionary investors, but high risk investors at a time when people I think often forget that before the steam engine came along, the Industrial Revolution was driven by water in one way or the other, water power, water transport. And the same was happening all over the UK and all over Europe at that time. It was an extraordinary, hard to imagine now, people with the tools and equipment available to them at the time digging this Mucklegreat trench across the centre of Scotland to take boats, but they did it, and they did it with private money. Extraordinary. Then came the decline when the railways came along in the early to mid 19th century. The railways came along, and unfortunately that rapidly usurped the canals. Much cheaper and easier to stick coal and everything else on trains, so people did. Rapid period of decline into the 20th century, really right through the 20th century, and then a relaunch, and I won't talk about that more. And we're now on a trajectory, I think, a regrowth, renaissance, rebirth trajectory now in Scotland at any rate. Wee bit more on the history, but I'm not going to talk a lot in great depth. The information's available, but as I say, planned and designed in the early 18th century by visionary investors, visionary individuals, quite extraordinary. At the same time, or just after, those same sorts of people were doing it elsewhere in Scotland. This is actually an early drawing of what became the Monkland Canal, because people quickly realized that if Coatbridge, Motherwell were going to grow, and they were pretty much at that point the center of global iron and steel, that we had to get iron ore and coal in, and we had to get iron out effectively, and horse and cart was not going to do the job, which at that time it was. And in fact, my great grandfather at that time lived and worked in the steel mills in Coatbridge, and it was a remarkable period. Early on, it was all about freight. It wasn't about anything else. We don't have pictures, unfortunately, of the very early stages. So what you're actually seeing there is a steam barge, a barge with a steam engine. But there were still at that time some horse-drawn barges. But worth remembering that in those early stages, it was all horse-drawn, which in itself was remarkable. Think of the number of animals and the logistics of that, of moving horses around. But it was initially freight, and it was initially mainly about coal and steel and wool, and later on about food, getting food into urban conurbations to feed that industrial revolution. But also increasingly, this photograph's much more recent, but we don't have photographs from the period, but actually quite big freight came into Glasgow and up the canal from elsewhere in the UK and overseas. You know, quite large vessels, big sailing vessels were coming in through Bowling into Port Dundas and Spears Wharf and unloading cargo, T-clippers, all this sort of stuff was getting in. And there's still some remnants there. If you have time to go to Port Dundas and have a look at what we've just recently uncovered along the front there, this extraordinary and I think rather beautiful sandstone wharf, and just shut your eyes and imagine that just bustling with people unloading all sorts of bales of this and boxes of that, and it must have been extraordinary. But then people clicked that it wasn't just about freight, it was about people, and they started moving people along the canals because it was more comfortable and not necessarily faster, but more comfortable than going by horse and carriage, which was the only other thing you could do. And this is a remarkable advert for a sleeper service from Glasgow to Edinburgh, or Edinburgh to Glasgow. It went both ways, where you hopped on in the evening, had your dinner and a whiskey, went to bed, and arrived in Glasgow or Edinburgh the next morning. And so that you can imagine it was an 8-hour trip. So sorry, 7-hour trip pulled by horses. You can see the picture there. An extraordinary experience. I mean, I love going on the sleeper down to London, but I would have even more enjoyed being shot across Scotland in a barge overnight. It must have been great. And then it suddenly became a leisure thing for these huge urban populations who'd previously been pretty much unable to get out of urban Scotland. And urban Scotland was a pretty grim place at that time, highly polluted, dense populations, limited services and infrastructure as the Industrial Revolution demanded labour and sucked people in from the country. So suddenly the canal became a way of escaping out of urban Scotland, and people who'd built barges to carry freight suddenly realised they could carry people. And you can just imagine how exciting that must have been for people whose lives were, to be honest, pretty grim in many other ways. I find that I can get very boring about this, but I find it very exciting and very inspiring because it was so central to that period of industrial revolution. Also, actually, the canals fueled an interesting sort of inventiveness. This is the Vulcan, which was the first ironclad ship to be built in I think in the world, but certainly in the UK. It's now at Summerley Museum, just out by Kirk Bridge, where there's a wee remnant bit of the Monkland. Well worth a visit, actually. That's a replica, not the original, I should say. But it did, so it fueled more than just freight. It started to fuel inventiveness and all the rest of it. An important time shipbuilding. And of course, the canals had a great workforce, a large workforce. They were a big employer. We give them better clothes nowadays, but it was very important, lots of it was a high skilled job too. I think people forget that still is a high skilled job. Actually, you're managing water flows, you're managing quite sophisticated equipment, locks, engineering assets, and so on. So very, very important in lots of different ways. Just a wee slightly humorous anecdote. Later on, people started to innovate even further, and this is just a picture of a pole vaulting competition that was held on the Forth and Clyde. Actually, I think it was probably about the middle of last century, probably post-war. It became used for all sorts of fun things, and one of the fun things was you could pole vault. But sadly, and possibly inevitably, the whole thing was nationalised in 1948. The whole system. It became British Waterways, and it was closed in '63 to navigation. It just wasn't viable. Government voters were not prepared to pay to sustain something that wasn't really delivering. At that time, what was wanted of it, which was a transport link. And even now, Scottish Canals sits, I report to the Transport Minister, even though we're not really a transport system any longer. So the whole thing declined. It became a kind of rubbish dump. People threw old cars in it. It became a very sad place. And increasingly, I think it became a quite damaging and dangerous place for parts of urban Scotland, for communities, a bit like vacant and derelict land is now. And that's a big issue for the Land Commission now, actually. And these places pull down the communities that live near them. They pull them down mentally, they pull them down economically, socially. They're dangerous, they're depressing, they cause pollution, all sorts of things. And they became a serious problem, actually. I don't think there's any question about that. A public hazard and all the rest of it. And so some were filled in, not always with great success. This machine got stuck, but some were filled in. And the M8 is probably the biggest bit of filling in, because it was actually built along the corridor of the Monklands Canal. The Monklands Canal provided a convenient route for the M8. So we lost chunks, but then other chunks stayed, particularly in the rural bits of Scotland. This is actually the Union Canal, but it's not far from the Forth and Clyde. It's just near Falkirk. And it was still being used for recreation, well after other bits had been abandoned. I think this, I'm not quite sure of the date of this, but it's long ago. And it was, it remained attractive and well used. And then some, what I see as really quite wonderful architectural bits of architectural heritage were completely lost. This is actually the flight of locks at Falkirk that joins the Forth and Clyde to the Union, or joined, I beg your pardon, because it doesn't exist any longer. Very sad. But there are some wonderful bits of architectural heritage. If you have not been to Maryhill Locks, please go. It's a beautiful, beautiful place to go. And our ancestors did us proud, designing and building things like that. But we lost this one. It's sad. But then, at the end of the 20th century, a kind of revival suddenly took off, and it's quite interesting to try and understand why, because it was driven by driven by civic demand. It wasn't really government. It's a very interesting thing. Why did, after decades of decline and just dereliction and filling things in, suddenly this thing took off? Falkirk Wheel was the sort of big visible thing, the Millennium Wheel, funded from the Millennium Lottery. But what is interesting is that all over central Scotland in particular, because the ones up in the Highlands had been sustained, but all over central Scotland, local groups in Falkirk and in Bowling, in Lithgow, and many other places I could name, grew up and started to say, look, we don't want to lose this. We need to stop. And they organized themselves, and they raised money, and they planned, and it was an extraordinary period, but it was civic driven. It was not driven by government. Government had to follow and catch up. And I think that's something quite important about that, I think, for the future of our country. So this was built to replace the locked flight that I just showed you that had disappeared, and it's become a kind of world-class visitor attraction. And it, people came out in droves, and they still do. This is actually relatively recently, this photograph, but people come out in droves to see this and see the boats and see what's happening, and they love it. And I think, that's enormously important. It still is. And the canals had become a leisure resource. I was at the Falkirk Wheel this week on Tuesday, and there were loads of people there, and I've been there right through the summer. It's been really busy. It's been a hugely important holiday destination through the so-called staycation period, and people love it. And even on Tuesday of this week, at the time when there are not a lot of coach parties going around the place, coach parties were queuing up to drop off people at the Falkirk Wheel. It's a measure of how this has gone on. We're 21 years after the building of it. And it's also really interesting as an exemplar of Scottish engineering abilities, because it was highly innovative at its time. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but it's, in engineering terms, remarkable. And it was Scottish engineers that did it, and it still attracts these This was a group of people on motorbikes from the Netherlands who had come all the way up to see the Falkirk Wheel, because they're all engineers and they work at some engineering place in the Netherlands. And they were there on Tuesday to see it. So we can be pretty proud of that, I think. There was also another programme at the Grangemouth end of the Forth and Clyde, and that was that we'd built 2 roads since the canal had been put in place. And you can see it there. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to see my wee arrow, but the canal came out here, but then we'd stuck a road at motorway in there, and we'd stuck a road in there. And so it was, in fact, extremely difficult, even at low tide, to get your boat through. And so the thing had become pretty much unnavigable because of that. So, and again, this is one of these sort of rather remarkable stories. So it was decided, the people at Scottish Canals said, look, well, let's see if we can build a canal that will take us up here and out past the roads and out, and that's it. That's the canal. But in order to get boats under the motorway, because you can't put a bridge in a motorway, that's a raising bridge. But this one, you can't have a raising bridge. They had to put a lift in to drop the boats down under the motorway and back up. So somebody said, well, why don't we make it quite interesting and put a couple of sort of nodding horses' heads so that it's a boat lift. There are boat lifts. There's one at Leamington in Edinburgh. So the initial plan was a boat lift with a couple of nodding horses' heads. And then somebody else said, well, why don't we just make a bit more of this and let's make a real statement. And the outcome, without cut a long story short, is that we ended up with these extraordinary and pretty iconic bits of public art, the Kelpies. And again, unusually for public art, people actually didn't criticize it. There was one slightly negative piece in The Sun, not noted for praising public art, otherwise widely acclaimed, still very popular. We light them up in different colors for different reasons. Sometimes the flags of different countries, all sorts of things. And they are still seen by most Scots as a positive thing. So that's a quick rush through the history. There's a huge amount to it. There's lots of stuff on the website. That's just a shot of the web page. So if you go to scottishcanals.co.uk, you'll find lots more if you want to know more. What I want to do now is just talk fairly quickly about the last 20 years since we got the thing open, and then to discuss with you where next, because I think the where next question is hugely important and it needs input. So the last 20 years, we've seen boating recover, and it's wonderful. People are buzzing up and down. This is a traditional canal boat, but of course, there are lots of different boats buzzing up and down the canal now. Not all motorized at all. Some, rowing boats, all the rest of it. So it's been great, and it's a great asset. It's an unusual asset because you're trundling through urban areas 1 minute, rural areas the next. You're in a tunnel, you're on an aqueduct. It's an extraordinary thing for central Scotland and for people. And I think that will continue to grow because it is so different, really. And I love it. I mean, I love the canal. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of space in central Scotland. And people trundle along and they moor up for the night, or they just moor up and they leave their boat there or whatever. I'm sorry, these are all the traditional boats. There are plenty other more normal boats as well. And some people live on these boats, and we've built these little cabins. If you see top of the slide, a couple of cabins, we've built these little cabins so that people can keep their stuff there and live on the canal if they wish. You can rent that and rent a mooring. And so it's also increasingly becoming a place where folk live. And I think that is one of the really important things for the future. We've got this massive area of real estate in Scotland that just happens to be wet, and we're not using it to anything like its full potential for housing, despite dealing with a housing shortage. This is Leamington Wharf, bang in the middle of Edinburgh, and that's a houseboat, the Blue Hue. And those cabins are available to rent as our moorings. We could have loads more of this. It's growing. It's grown a lot in my 7 years, and I'm very pleased with that. You see it in Edinburgh. In Glasgow. I'm sorry I haven't got good photographs from the Glasgow end, but we've seen a big growth in houseboats in Glasgow, and I'm pleased with that. And people customize. This is actually this lady's garden, very keen gardener, and her boat's turned into a garden. But fine, that's you know that, and you know there's pretty much no limit to what a floating house can look like. It doesn't have to be a traditional boat at all. We've worked with developers, because we own some of the land on either side. We've worked with developers to create basins for houseboats. This one's at Ratho, but we've also created one at Winchborough, and I think so. There's no shortage of space and no shortage of potential. What we need now we need to actually people like the people that were around in the early 18th century, imaginative risk investors who will not just build a floating house for themselves, but will invest in housing to rent. And I think that you know, in the next 20 years, we'll see a big change. There are other boats, one or two people now using boats as offices, as boats for charitable purposes. I can't remember exactly what this one's for. It's fairly new. There are boats taking people from care homes to get a trip. So there are other things we can do, and I'm very keen, particularly on the floating office idea, for the same reason, although the whole office market has been thrown into disarray. And there are people who are telling this is a botel, so-called, a floating hotel, and there's no reason why there shouldn't be a lot more investment in this sort of thing too, with Airbnb and all the rest of it. I see no reason why that shouldn't happen more. So loads of potential. We ourselves at the moment own a number of boats which we hire out from Falkirk, and people effectively a floating holiday cottage. You take it for a week and take it where you like. This is like Tuesday of this week again, a whole load of them lying moored up at Edinburgh. People had gone into Edinburgh because it was raining and they thought they'd go there. So there's, you know, no shortage of demand. And of course, on the other canals, just to make the point, I'm not going to belabor this one, there are other kinds of boats. This is the Caledonian, used a lot by yachts and sailors because it connects up different lochs. There's military boats, there's big hotel boats, there's one wonderful great big boat that's a luxury place that's used by Americans and others. And occasionally, as in earlier this year, you get these so-called oligarchs with their massive super yachts turning up and using the canal too. And lastly, on the floating things, occasionally you'll see things like this on the Forth and Clyde. This is actually one of ours. It's a boat for cutting and removing weed, because weed growth in the high summer is a serious problem for us, as is tree branch growth, because if the trees fall in the canal, you can't get past, so we have to send folk out to cut them. And we are doing our best to get towards net zero. I do want to just reassure people, because there's still a lot of motor stuff, but we're not there. On other kinds of boats, in many ways, the canal lends itself, I think, to non-motorized boat use. And that, in my 7 years, has grown enormously. And it's been one of my personal priorities to push that up. This is a group of refugees, actually, from Syria, getting the opportunity to go out and paddle on the canal. And that's hugely important, confidence building and all the rest of it. It's a tremendous opportunity, but it's also something that is open to absolutely everybody. This is not the Forth and Clyde. This is actually I think that's the Caledonian. But canoe tourism on the canals has grown enormously. Certainly this year there will be far more people transiting the Caledonian in a non-motorized boat than in a motorized boat, which I'm really pleased about. Really, really pleased about. And I couldn't resist putting that one in, just because it's from the Caledonian, sorry, not the Forth and Clyde, but it makes the point that it's an exciting and adventurous thing to do. But above all, and this is the bit that I care about, above all, the canal has a really, really important role in the lives of young people and kids in central Scotland. It's a massive, massive resource. And we're seeing more and more schools are doing that. Earlier this week, I met a school group out on the canal at 9:15 in the morning, having a whale of a time. And it's not just it's not just to make the point. It isn't just canoes either. A rapid growth area now are these things called paddleboards. I don't know if you've tried it. I tried recently for the first time. They are actually a lot of fun. And I think this may well be a growth area, but it doesn't matter, frankly, what it is. What matters is that we use these publicly owned assets to deliver as much public value as we possibly can for as many people as we possibly can. And that increasingly, and certainly through the pandemic, has meant young people, people in houses that don't have gardens, all this sort of stuff. There are social enterprises now developing. This one's called the Bridge 8 Hub, and they are really important partners to us. We are publicly funded. There's a limit to what we can do. Public funding is not particularly plentiful, but we can partner up with social enterprises and they can do a lot more. This one, these guys do a fantastic job and they're incredibly good at raising money. They're also rather good at canal side art. I do love that these are containers where they keep their canoes and stuff. And I love it. This is another wee private business, just to make the private enterprise point again, that this is not just about government and it's not just about the third sector. There are endless opportunities for small businesses to develop along the canal. These guys, out there every weekend and on weekdays in the summer, renting out kit. And there are lots of other wee boats. There's cafes and all that sort of stuff too, small businesses. We need to make more of that. Loads of information there if you want on the website. Wee bit about the towpath, just to sort of bring this to a close. So when I started, it was a rather muddy track across Scotland. Not great. I cycled it and got pretty filthy in the process. We've tarmacked it. It is now all the way from Glasgow to Edinburgh, along the Forth and Clyde, then the Union. There's this wonderful ribbon of tarmac, undisturbed by motor cars or anything else. Loads of people using it. This is not actually the Forth and Clyde, this is the Caledonian, doesn't matter. Masses of people now using it, especially this summer. It's been a very important piece of recreational space. It's also a commuter strip at either end of the central canals. Into Glasgow, the number of commuters is growing. We've got people counters out, we can see that. Into Edinburgh, it's growing too. And there's some exciting and fun bits. There's these tunnels, that's the Falkirk Tunnel, I think. Yes, that's the Falkirk Tunnel, and that is the Roughcastle Tunnel. Great to do, fun places to walk, fun places to take kids, easily accessible. Both of these are a short walk from Falkirk High Station, so jump on a train and go and have a wee look. Again, loads of stuff on the website, guides and all the rest of it. Cycling, I'm very keen to see more cycling on the canals, as long as people cycle responsibly. There's no reason why we shouldn't. And we will need to widen the towpaths over time, no question in my mind. We now have electric hire bikes at the Falkirk wheels, so you can jump on a bike and cycle down to the Kelpies and back along the canal. You don't need to go anywhere near a road. Please do. Again, it's a family thing. I think, you don't need a lot of money to do this. A tremendous opportunity. And I just make the point that jogging is too. And interestingly, this is a cargo bike. I just want to show where I think the future might start to lie. This is someone who does some work for us, keeping back the undergrowth, and he takes all his kit on a cargo bike. But I've also met other people on the towpath going to work on cargo bikes. I met someone the other day, he was a window cleaner. He had a big basin of water on the back of a cargo bike and a whole heap of stuff, and he was going from client to client along the canal. Again, more stuff on the website if you wanted about where the routes are and so on. Some brief things on other things, but which I think are important. Fishing, important because it's free and it's low cost and anyone can do it and kids love it. A new one recently, which is called magnet fishing, which is tying a big heavy magnet, which you can buy on Amazon for a relatively small amount of money, on a piece of rope, dragging it through the canal, see what you can find, usually an old bike or a shopping trolley, but people love it. Again, low cost way of getting people outdoors and doing stuff. Volunteering, we're struggling a wee bit with COVID. We've had to put this on a wee bit on hold, but getting people out there volunteering on the canal seems to me important. We've had a scheme with ex-prisoners. We've had a scheme with recovering drug addicts. There are a lot of different things we could do there, I think, going forward. And big events. This is the one at Neptune's at the Glasgow end. Every year it's called the Red Bull event. People dive into the canal and swim up and climb things, and it brings thousands of people to watch. It's great fun if you haven't seen it. Not quite sure what's happening this year with COVID, or next year rather. And that's
just, you know, we put these big rope things and people climb up the locks, and it's mad. I have to confess, I haven't done that one. Organised more and more, I think we can organise places along the canal. This is Spears Wharf. It's a place for kayaking. There's a big basin there. This is run as a form of social enterprise. It works pretty well. It's got a big pump and water goes up and then down this thing so that people can train. It's very exciting. Interestingly, the fire service also borrow it from time to time to train getting people out of rescuing people from rivers. And we've got a lot of property. We haven't got enough money to do it all up. Far too much of it is still derelict. If you go along the Forth and Clyde, you'll see derelict buildings still, but we must do something. We have managed in some cases. This one has become this, and I'm really pleased with it. It's actually an old lighthouse, believe it or not, but there's much more we can do with property, I think, along the canals. And we don't necessarily need to do it ourselves. Let's try and bring private investors into this. Private investors do things well. We can diversify and make places more interesting. We have land round the canals, particularly around the Falkirk Wheel, for example. There's lots of stuff we can do there. We've just invested in a crazy golf course, but I'd much rather we didn't. I'd much rather private people did that. Bowling at the other end, we've been investing heavily there. I'm very hopeful that we can turn bowling into a much more significant destination for the people of Glasgow so that people can head out there. It's not far, it's 10 miles from the centre of Glasgow, all along the canal. You don't need to go on the road. You can get the train home if you're tired. And we've done something quite imaginative with the arches in the bridge at bowling, but there's still more I think we can do there. And lastly, just on the area into Pinxton, and North Glasgow. This was the connection between Glasgow City and North Glasgow, and that meant that the canal was forgotten for a long time. This was put in, they're called the metal petals. It was intended to try and make it more attractive for people to come out from Glasgow City into North Glasgow and reconnect. It worked a bit. There's now a bridge being built over the motorway, of course. But what has happened already is that Spears Lock has gone from this, a pretty rundown area, to this, a lot of stuff happening. So regeneration can be driven by a canal if you connect it up and bring people into it. And I think there's an awful lot more we can do. That's the old Whiskey Bond, and that's what the Whiskey Bond looks like now. It's full of businesses and offices and people working and jobs and all the rest of it. So this can be done. That's right next to the canal. But it needs to involve people and it needs to be driven by people. And they will figure this out. It has to be civically driven. I think that's hugely important. But look at where Spears Loch and the canal sits, just north of the M8 there, between the M8 and Keppoch Hill, Firhill, Maryhill, Cowlairs, Sight Hill, Port Dundas Hill rather, sorry. Extraordinary potential to regenerate that whole bit of Glasgow using the canal as the connector. So that's where our aspirations and focus in the Glasgow end are at the moment. That's a wee poster about it. It's what it could look like. And we see housing as absolutely central to all that, up and down Dundas Hill in particular in the short term, but elsewhere further ahead. And housing, let's try and get away. This is me and the Land Commission job speaking now, but let's get away from the kind of identikit housing. Let's think differently about regeneration going forward. We're building a new bridge to improve connectivity at the Firhill Stockingfield end. We've put walkways in and we're doing more. Think of all those people living in those flats during lockdown. Think of how valuable the canal was to them. Think how valuable that canal is going to go on being to them now. New moorings, this could be lined up with houseboats, with floating boats. It will be, I'm convinced. And Claypits Nature Reserve, which is very much community driven, is right there on the canal in the north. A lot of that is driven by the smart canal. I think I'm not going to bore you with this just now, but we've developed this technology to use the canal to manage flood events. And with climate change and floods becoming more of a problem, the canal, I think, will become more important, not just in Glasgow, but also in Edinburgh. So we've come from here, certainly well within my lifetime, and certainly, well, I mean, that's probably 1980s, 1990s. It's not long ago. We've come from there, and that's where we are now. I think the big question, the question that really interests me now, is where do we go next with this resource? It's publicly owned, it's publicly managed, it's publicly funded, we control it. It belongs to every single one of you. Big question, what are we going to do with it? So I'll stop at that, and hopefully maybe have prompted you to offer me some answers. I'd be very grateful. And I'll see if I can come out of this screen too. There we are.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have a slight humming noise. It stopped now. I had a slight humming noise in my Zoom, but it's now gone. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was very informative. I think a lot of us have probably been along some of that canal, certainly locally. The fairly newly regenerated bit along to Spears Wharf has been a popular walking spot for a lot of us, and it's really interesting. Any observations or questions for Andrew? Remember to unmute yourself, Hazel. Blake, unmute yourself first.
I'd just like to say how much we've appreciated the canal during lockdown. But on Monday, my husband and I walked from Bowling to Clyde Bank, took the train to Bowling and walked back to Clyde Bank, partly because a couple of us are hoping to start a local walking group, and I was kind of raking it and how much we enjoyed it. I've done right from Clyde Bank, right from Bowling, more than that in the past, but also my grandson, my 10-year-old grandson, had his birthday party a few weeks ago in canoeing at the place you showed us, and it was the children all said it was the best birthday party they've had ever. So I just want to congratulate you on how much we appreciate the canals.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. I'll pass that back because it's so motivating for staff to hear that kind of thing. Thank you.
Bev?
I'd like to say that
Yes,
you have deprived school children of Falkirk or something. When I was small, I used to cycle from Camden to Falkirk, and I crossed over the bridge at Lock 16. But my excuse if I was late was that the bridge was up. But you can't get that anymore. Have you ever taken the Canal du Midi?
No, I haven't. I cycle. I do this job really by cycling because it's the only way to visit the staff along the canal. But I have also now cycled most of the English canals. My daughter has recently moved to Maastricht in the Netherlands, so the Netherlands is next on the list. Canal du Midi.
You should really go and see the Canal Latéral de la Garonne, because it has a boat lift in which the boat is pushed up a slope by a moving panel sort of thing. It's incredible to see it. It's well worth a visit. I did a trip from right down the canals, right down to Marseille, almost to Marseille. It was fantastic. But I'm very disappointed that school children can't use that as an excuse anymore.
Plenty of excuses for late coming. Now, but a couple of hands up. Viv, and then we'll have Rosalind. Viv?
Yes, you made a passing reference to expanding the pathway. I certainly found living in the West End that I feel quite threatened on the path by extremely aggressive cyclists, and somehow or other it needs to be split. I know you do your best, you put up signs and ask for people to be considerate, but something more needs to be done about this within the city area.
Do you mean about cyclists coming up behind you?
Yes, the whole aggressive, they're not using the bell. I was on a path, a converted disused railway line on the Isle of Wight, and I was astounded at the consideration that the cyclists were making to the walkers in comparison to what happens in our city here.
So very much agree with you, Viv. Short term, there is no easy answer other than getting out there and trying to lead by example and put notices up and all this sort of stuff. But people are people, and human nature is human nature. It is intensely frustrating. The long-term answer, I'm convinced, is to widen the towpaths and probably separate. We know from elsewhere where cyclists and walkers share space that the way to do it is to separate, public parks and so on. You'll see it, but local authorities are doing that now, right now, actually, all over Scotland. There's separated provision being put in. So that's where it has to go. But government is not flush with cash at the moment, and so that has to be a long-term aspiration. It's not going to happen in a hurry.
Thank you for that. Rosalind? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I have 2 points. The first one is there any way the canal could be used to alleviate the accommodation problems at COP26? There's an awful lot of appeals for accommodation for particularly poorer delegates. Also the theatres are having, the King's Theatre having problems in the pavilion with accommodation. And the other question was what happens with the sewage from the barges?
Ah, good question. Two good questions.
So the second one first, we have it is rigorously regulated by us. There's a pumping system. You have to, you cannot put any effluent whatsoever into the canal. That's really important. There's a quite a sophisticated pumping system that we run, which is why developing residential moorings takes time, because it has to have infrastructure built into it, not just for sewage, but also water and electricity. So that one I can absolutely assure you on. And actually, the water quality is remarkably good in Scotland's canals. COP26, there is no doubt whatsoever that there is a huge potential to build floating housing on the canals. And if you go to other countries, or even you just need to go to London, actually, you can see how it's done. The canals in London are double parked with all sorts of different kinds of floating homes. So that can be done. I don't think it can be done in a hurry for COP26, however, because obviously it means, well, first of all, it means finding investors prepared to invest in, build, and then lease accommodation on the canals. And then secondly, it means putting that in place, and at times extending infrastructure, although at the moment there's enough infrastructure to take quite a few more. So I don't think it's going to deal with the COP26 problem. I need to be very honest about that.
Is there no way kind of an appeal could go out to those who have barges and accommodation to make it available if they're not using it?
Can I take that one away? I think that's a really good idea, because there are barges that are not lived in, but which are livable in. I'll take that away. Thank you. I think that's a really helpful thought.
Thank you for that. Any other comments, Danny? You need to answer.
Yeah, I enjoy your talk very much, Andrew. I was brought up on the canal, well, about 100 yards away from the canal as a kid, and I remember when it was a busy place, there was lots of boats could by, and it was much excitement when it would by the bridge at Lamb Hill, and all the kids used to run underneath the bridge to hear it bump and echo. That was one of the highlights of the day, but it happened 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. I've not seen a proper boat on the canal for many years, and I've never been able to get the information on how many boats actually use the canal. I looked up your annual report one year and it said there's been an increase of 300% in the usage of the canal, which I assume meant last year there was one, and 2 years ago there was one, and that year it was covered. There's now got 3 boats going. There's in the last year, the only person I've seen use the canal was a guy in full Highland dress, paddle boarding in Mary Hill, which I wish I'd taken a photograph of it, but he was quite a brave man doing that. But there's a number of things I'd like to say. I think the clay pits, the initiative there is great. It really is. The information boards you have up are really good, and your leaflets are fantastic. There's a lot of good things happening, but I don't actually see the sort of core activity of getting boats on the canal. I don't see much evidence of that. And I would like to know how many people are actually staying on the canal in boats, because I've never seen a figure for that either, whether it's 10 or 20 or 100. How many are actually approximately living on the canal? Do you know?
Okay, so the last bit first, I don't know, but I think it's in the hundreds. I don't know off the top of my head how many are living on the canal. I agree, the Glasgow end of the system has been slower to develop than the other end. That's absolutely true. I've been out on the canal all summer, but I was out this week and there were a lot of boats moving on the Union Canal this week, but not on the Forth and Clyde. I also think it's worth distinguishing between a big boat with a motor and a floating, any other kind of boat. I often cycle Port Dundas out to Bowling. I always see people out in canoes and paddleboards. So there are a lot of craft out on that bit of the canal, but they're not. It's not at the moment particularly popular with boats. One of the reasons for that is that there are locks and therefore it's slower. The Union Canal has the advantage of having almost no locks in it, so it's much easier for traveling. But it absolutely has to be an ambition to keep driving this up. There's a limit. I think we have to be just a little bit cautious about what we ask government to do and what we try and get the private enterprise to do. Government, I don't think government is in the business and probably shouldn't be in the business of buying boats and renting boats and building houseboats and all this sort of thing. That is the job of the private sector. And what we need to do is to make sure the infrastructure is good, make sure it's well managed, weeds kept clear and all that. And we need to keep talking it up. But in the time I've done this job, I've seen the number of houseboats, living boats at the Glasgow end rise quite sharply. So I am pretty optimistic about the Glasgow end. I think it's coming. But I guess my ask of you would be, please help us talk it up.
Yeah, keep it in foremost. It's great to see all the young people using the Pinkston Basin as well. I mean, that's really good. Any other questions or comments or observations?
Yes. I just wondered, we saw all that rubbish in the canals at the beginning. Now that they're looked after better, is that still a problem? I mean, not cars maybe, but do people still just hurl bottles and whatever rubbish they've got in?
It is still a problem. I don't think it's going to go away. People abuse public space. You just go to the city parks, you'll see it. It's a never-ending problem because it's expensive to constantly try and do. You obviously picking up litter in a park's hard. Picking up litter on a canal is even harder. So, believe it or not, car people do still dump cars in the canal. So it still happens. We still every so often have to haul a car out. They certainly chuck shopping trolleys, bicycles, all that sort of stuff in the canal, which is partly why I rather like the magnet fishers, because they help us get it out again. But there's something in human nature which is hard to turn, and why it's why I think civic support, civic pride is enormously important in trying to limit this, but we'll never stop it.
Do you know about the day the canal went on fire?
Yeah, I was going to use a photograph of it actually, but you're talking about the tar factory, when the tar factory went on fire.
That's right. Somebody turned a tap in Scottish car distillers and let benzene onto the top of the canal, which of course floats. Somebody going past threw a match into it and up it went in flames. It was about 100 yards from our house, so I remember it quite well. The other thing about the canal was that it was often used for getting rid of dogs. People used to put a dog in a sack and throw it in the canal to get rid of it. That's a long time ago. And although there was up from Loch 16 towards onwards, there was a wee place we called the Sandy Beach, where we used to go and swim. I don't suppose it's there anymore. But when I think about all the dead dogs and things, I'm surprised I've survived to this age already. Should have had tetanus long ago.
Well, yeah, I mean, people constantly talk about this, but I mean, actually, all the testing we do suggests that the water quality is pretty high, and people do swim in the canals. There are actually, you know, at Spears Wharf, for example, in the basin there's organised cold water swimming sessions and triathlon training and that sort of stuff. And actually, one of the things I'm interested in for the future, given the really rapid growth in cold water swimming enthusiasm through lockdown, you know, it's not just the canals. We've also got I think it's 19 reservoirs that we managed to feed the canal system. So I'm actually very, very interested in how do we use these public water spaces to respond to the public, what is clearly a strong public aspiration to go cold water swimming, go outside.
Viv?
I just wondered, I used to be a paddler. I had a kayak, and there was always I guess it was fear that if we ever capsized on the canal, there was the danger of Weil's disease. Has that been removed, that danger?
As far as I'm aware, so I can't give you a cast iron because there may still be a low risk, but it's a pretty low risk. The bigger risk, and it's not a huge one, is from algal bloom in the summer and blue-green algae. But we put up notices when that's a risk. So we do, when there is a known risk, we'll put notices up warning people. But these risks are often overstated by people. I wouldn't have personally, I wouldn't hesitate to swim in the canal. I do kayak in it, I do canoe in it regularly, paddle in it regularly, and I'm not afraid of falling out either. I think these things are overstated. If you look at the water flows is the key thing. There are certain sort of bits of the canal, particularly at the ends, where water was not so much actually at the Glasgow end, because water comes in under the M8 and in at Spears Wharf, so there's a flow through there. But at the Edinburgh end, there is a sort of bit at the Edinburgh end where there isn't much flow, and that's probably the bit that I would be most concerned about. Otherwise, it's pretty good.
What about the rats?
Well, I mean, there's rats everywhere, but there's this sort of truism, you're never more than a few meters from a rat. There's a lot of otters and stuff on the canal too, so that are doing their best to control it. But you know, there's wildlife of all kinds on the canal. You know, and water voles and all the rest of it. They're not necessarily carriers of disease.
These otters, are they near the Glasgow end?
They have been seen along towards Glasgow, but not often. The ones that have been stuck up on social media have all been at the Edinburgh end. But there's no question there. I mean, they're in the system. They will pop up all over the place over the next few years.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe time for one more observation before 11:30, before we finish.
I was wondering if I could, I don't know if you can hear. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is there any plan to have commercial sales from one end of the canal, say from Glasgow to Edinburgh? Is that something being thought about?
A number of people have thought about that, and at the moment there isn't enough demand to put on a kind of water bus. So there is talk about a water bus coming into Glasgow, interestingly. You can, however, I mean, it is perfectly possible to charter. There are people who offer services where you can charter a boat and they will take you from Edinburgh to Glasgow or Glasgow to Edinburgh. So you can do that. There just isn't a bus. And in fact, not that I'm going to take her the whole way away, but my mother is 90 next month, and I'm seriously thinking about taking her and some friends on a you know, chartering what amounts to a water bus and taking her along the canal. I think it's a great thing to do.
Well, there we go. A really nice way to celebrate a 90th birthday. Thank you very much, Andrea. I think you realise that you've generated a lot of interest just by the number of questions and observations that we are. I think maybe during lockdown, for me anyway, I'd discovered more of the canals around Glasgow, and that was been really good. You know, the walks and things that have been organised, been a real eye-opener, and a lot of work has been done in the canals around Glasgow, so that's great. So thank you for your informative talk. We know now where to look at the website, etc., and hopefully we can get out there again and enjoy the canals. Thank you so much. Really interesting talk, and thank you very, very much. And we'll see you all at the AGM in October. More about that. Thanks very much indeed.